Welcome to this conversation with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. We appreciate your spending some time with us today. Well, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the hateful Anti-Semitic United Nations Conference Against Racism, which was held in Durban, South Africa in 2001. Organized to address issues related to racism and discrimination, the conference devolved into an all-out campaign to delegitimize Israel and its supporters. And joining me today to talk about the consequences of Durban are Canada's newly appointed Special Envoy for Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, Professor Irwin Cotler, and former B'nai B'rith President and current American Zionist Movement President, Richard Heideman. Both will share their reflections on the infamous conference, lessons learned, and prescriptives for future action. Irwin Cotler is the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and longtime member of Parliament, and an international human rights lawyer. He was recently appointed Canada's first ever Special Envoy for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism by the Canadian government. A constitutional law scholar, Professor Cotler is the author of numerous publications and seminal legal articles, and has intervened in landmark cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, anti-Semitism, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. Richard Heideman is senior counsel at Heideman, Noodleman, and Kalick, which is committed to holding sponsors of terror legally accountable. He serves as lead counsel representing American victims of terrorism in claims brought or pending against Libya, Syria, Iran, the PLO, and other organizations and financial institutions accused of providing material support for terrorism. He currently serves as president of the American Zionist Movement and previously completed a 5-year term as chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Lawyers Committee, among other numerous Jewish groups. At the time of the original Durban conference, Heideman also served as president of our organization. Irwin, Richard, great to have you both with us today.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so please set the table for us. Going into the Durban conference, what were your expectations based on what the United Nations World Conference Against Racism was advertised to be about? Irwin, why don't you start?
Well, when it was first announced, actually it was in 1997, I greeted the announcement with anticipation, if not excitement. This was to be the first international human rights conference of the 21st century. This conference was to have anti-racism as an organizing theme. And this was taking place in Durban, South Africa, which had been one of the focal points of the anti-apartheid movement, and I felt this would be an opportunity to showcase the anti-apartheid movement at the time and since. Regrettably, a world conference against racism turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people. Regrettably, a conference that was to showcase the whole issue of international human rights and the struggle against apartheid classified Israel as the meta-human rights violator of our time, the kind of the new anti-Christ of our time, in a world in which human rights had emerged, particularly at the time of the conference, as a new secular religion of our time. And with regard to apartheid, I can still hear and see the marches in the streets of Durban and the chanting, which would go on and say, the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. So as I wrote then and since, that conference had a transformative impact, not only on my thinking, but I have to say, even on my psyche at the time in the conference.
Richard, what did you expect going in? You organized not only a B'nai B'rith delegation, but you were working with other Jewish organizations who were going to Durban for the conference. So what were you looking for?
Well, Dan, as you will recall, the United Nations had a previous conference in 1985, the Nairobi conference. And my wife Phyllis and I were designated as B'nai B'rith International NGO delegates to the Nairobi conference, and we went to Nairobi, Kenya, and we found a terribly anti-Semitic situation on the ground at the NGO forum and at the conference itself. So in the time period between 1985 and the proposed Durban conference, truly, things had not gotten better for Israel and the Jewish people. They had gotten worse. Although the Zionism racism resolution had been introduced in 1975 and was officially dismantled in 1991 at the United Nations, it nevertheless was fully embedded in the minds of all of the people who had been in Nairobi, and therefore, as we approached Durban, we did so with great trepidation. There were many discussions as to whether or not B'nai B'rith should go to the Durban conference. The State Department had discussions about whether the United States should go to the Durban conference, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry had those discussions. My own view as president of B'nai B'rith International, and at the time I also was chairman for the Conference of Presidents of the United Nations Committee, my own view was, if you're not at the party, excuse the expression, you can't dance on the dance floor, and excuse the metaphor. But the fact of the matter is, knowing what we knew from Nairobi, I felt it was very important that B'nai B'rith show up, and we did show up. Not just B'nai B'rith International, but B'nai B'rith Europe was there, B'nai B'rith Chile was there, B'nai B'rith Argentina was there, B'nai B'rith Canada was there. B'nai B'riths from all over the world came, along with other Jewish organizations, and we had an excellent representation. But there was no question that the attitude that Israel was an apartheid criminal state, that the Zionist state was dirty, permeated all aspects of our experience from the minute we arrived in Durban, and it continued until we walked out.
Irwin, looking back now, Israel and the U.S. walked out of the conference a few days in. Had others joined, had other countries and NGOs joined in that, might the outcome of the conference been different?
I don't think the outcome of the conference would have been different had others joined. This thing was already almost institutionalized as an ethos. I was a member, I might add, of the Canadian delegation at the conference, while I was very much engaged with the NGO community, with B'nai B'rith and others, and with Tom Lantos, blessed memory, and the American delegation who did walk up. But I can tell you that the Rabbi Melchior was then the deputy foreign minister and head of the Israeli delegation, actually advised us, the Canadian delegation, not to walk out so that we could make the appropriate representations. In other words, there was a support for the walkout by the U.S. and Israel, but that the representations still needed to be made. I just want to make Richard reminded me when he talked about Nairobi, etc. We may have missed, I think, with the Durban conference, that in the run-up to the Durban conference, there were 4 regional conferences. One of those regional conferences, the Asian one, was held in Tehran. At that conference, neither Israel nor any Jewish NGOs were even able to participate. And then the Tehran conference itself issued the most scurrilous indictment against Israel since the end of the Second World War. And that framed what was to be afterwards the Declaration Against Racism and Plan of Action for the Durban Conference. I'm just going to itemize it because there were, not take time, but there were 7 components of that indictment. And they resonate in terms of what Israel is being subjected to today in terms of the demonization, dehumanization and delegitimization onto those 3 Ds. One could also add defamation and denial, like 5 Ds. But what were the indictments at the time? 1, occupation is a crime against humanity, a new form of apartheid, a threat to international peace and security. 2, Israel is an apartheid state. 3, Israel is a meta-human rights violator. 4, Israel is a perpetrator of international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. Hence, the right, quote unquote, to resistance against this, quote unquote, criminal state. 5, Israel as a Jewish state is an original sin established through ethnic cleansing of mandatory Arab Palestine. 6, the reference to Holocaust in that declaration is in the plural and in lowercase, with Israel as an example of a Holocaust against the Arabs. And finally, Zionism is declared to be not only a form of racism, but Zionism itself was declared to be, quote unquote, anti-Semitic. So the international community, I think, did not wake up early enough, including, as I said at the time, the Jewish community, because this was in 1997. This planned indictment was already there. And I remember coming to Israel at the time, and there was very little appreciation at the time as to what was awaiting us in Durban until we then encountered the Festival of Hate.
Richard, Irwin's referenced Michael Melchior's urging that folks stay in their seats and be there to defend Israel and to push back against what was going on. What was the sense among the Jewish NGOs once the U.S. and Israel had left? The weight of carrying the ball, as it were, was pretty much on your shoulders. Tell us a little about that.
Well, Dan, the conference was indeed a true hate fest toward Israel and all Zionists, toward the Jewish people. But we have to understand that it was at Durban where many things played out that we have now experienced over these last 20 years. So this look back is very important because, as Irwin said, perhaps nobody saw enough of what was coming because of what was discussed in the regional conferences. What was happening, though, on the ground in Durban was pure racism toward the Jewish people, pure hatred toward the Jewish people. It was a travesty because we were at a conference to battle against racism, against all people, to battle against hate and bigotry against all people. We were so marginalized. But the fact of the matter is, the United States and the government of Israel made the decision to walk out, and they did so in consultation with the Jewish and other NGOs. And when we walked out arm in arm, it really sent a reverberation through the conference. It was front page news with big photographs the next day in the UN conference newspaper. What we have to understand, though, is that it was at Durban, which occurred during the Second Intifada, that the seeds of hate were planted to launch a malicious, multi-pronged, diplomatic, academic, legal, and economic boycott and campaign of demonization against Israel. Those seeds of hate were in the making for many years prior. We have to also remember that dating all the way back to the formation of the Arab League, that the boycott of the Arab League began in the 40s and continued all the way up through the 70s, continued through the 80s, through the 90s, and existed already before Durban, but it blossomed after Durban because it not only became the Arab League boycott, it became a boycott that was supported by the very terrorist organizations that were launching suicide bombers and other attacks on Israel, on the Jewish people, and on Americans visiting in Israel. We could have seen all this coming in Durban, and the fact of the matter is we did. We knew that what we were going to experience after Durban was going to be pernicious hate. And it was in that context that we could not countenance that hate on the ground any further. We walked out proudly, arm in arm, and we have no regret for having done so.
Irwin, just the conference itself, the way it was structured, there were three primary components: the NGO conference, the anti-Semitic street demonstrations, and the main conference, which produced the Durban Declaration and Program of Action known as the DDPA. Were these three components distinct, or did they interact with each other?
No, they interacted, and they, in fact, the intersection really influenced each other. As I said, I was a member of the Canadian delegation, partook also of the NGOs, but when I say it was a festival of hate, I just found something that I wrote at the time, where I said that every thematic or regional tent, every street march, every demonstration, every communication or information medium was festooned with or disseminated booklets, placards, leaflets, bumper stickers that proclaimed Israel's racism, criminality, and illegality, with the notion of Israel as an apartheid state having a particular resonance in South Africa. So you could be a member of the Canadian delegation. You could not ignore, the atmospherics of the NGO conference, let alone of the Festival of Hate as a whole. And that, impacted on the decision making. Let me just say what happened right after Durban, because it's quite instructive in terms of the path to where we are today. Immediately in the aftermath of Durban, the Jews were blamed with regard to for 9/11 in a set of protocols reflective of what then was, the notion of a Jewish conspiracy, not unlike the whole notion of Jews being blamed all the way to today with regard to the COVID pandemic. The first thing. The second thing was with regard to anti-terrorism. At the time, in the immediate aftermath of Durban, any attempt to, in fact, classify resistance as terrorism, resistance, quote unquote, was jettisoned by the Arabs and their international supporters, contributing to not only the delegitimization of Israel, but the incentivization of attacks against Israel. A third thing, which right into the BDS movement, which has long been forgotten, that a global campaign against Israel apartheid was launched in the form of post-Durban calls for boycotts, divestments, sanctions, and in an astonishing, and I would say revelatory development at a pro-BDS conference in Michigan just weeks after Durban, a resolution calling for a two-state solution if, quote-unquote, Israel were to transform itself and become a real democracy, bad in and of itself, was defeated. But a resolution calling for the dismantling of Israel as a racist apartheid state was adopted at the University of Michigan weeks after BDS. And then the first UN Human Rights Conference meeting in the aftermath of Durban, not unlike the road to Durban, adopted half of its resolutions in condemnation of Israel, while the major human rights violators enjoyed exculpatory immunity. And the last thing, which has been ignored, again, the convening in December 2011, several months after the Durban conference, of the first ever contracting parties to the Geneva Convention that put one state in the docket. It was not Syria, it was not Iran, it was not any of the major human rights violators of the time. The only state put in the docket by the convening parties to the Geneva Convention was Israel. And in fact, since then, that the convening states to the Geneva Convention have convened 3 times only, and in each instance have put only Israel in the docket. So the delegitimization in a juridical sense in Israel as being the major violation of international human rights and humanitarian law began in the immediate aftermath of Durban, progressed, intensified, and took us down the road to where we are today.
Yeah, Richard, let's pick up on the BDS issue. As Irwin has said, and as you saw, the language that was adopted by the BDS movement that we see now in terms of apartheid state and all of the rest of that verbiage was born right there in Durban. What did you see at that time? And let's talk about BDS for a moment. In the beginning, many saw this starting on college campuses. We saw demonstrations and posters and the usual thing that one sees on a university campus. And there was a tendency in the beginning to think, well, maybe perhaps we could isolate it to that particular type of venue. But that's not been the case, because we see that BDS really has infused itself in so many different areas in which, whether it's in culture, the media, wherever one looks, you see the kind of language that was born really in Durban. So tell us about what you were thinking as you were about to leave Durban about what might be coming next, and in particular about the BDS issue.
Well, on the ground in Durban, there were, as Irwin has described, all these rallies focused on Israel as an apartheid racist criminal state. It was sort of like whenever you ask somebody, is it raining today? The answer was Israel is an apartheid racist criminal state. If you ask, look at the blue sky, the answer was Israel is an apartheid racist criminal state. They were well organized, well funded. Copies of the anti-Semitic protocols of the elders of Zion were sold on the conference grounds. And anti-Israel protesters really resurrected the Zionism equals racism charge, further demonizing Israel regarding her relations with the Palestinian Arabs. We have to remember, Dan, that this was in 2001. Only a few years before was the Madrid Conference, the Oslo Accords, the agreements to establish the Palestinian Authority, the agreements to enter into negotiations. The Hebron Accords had been signed, the Wye River Accords had been signed. And then you come to Durban, and one could have come with a sense of hope for the future. But instead, under the umbrella of the United Nations, the NGO Forum publicized the voice of the victims. The NGO Forum made it clear that everybody has to stand against Israel. The term demonization, the term Holocaust denial, the term Israel is anti-Semitism, equating Israel and the Jews with the Nazis was rampant all over the place. You know, I remember that the Jewish caucus convened with part of one of the sessions on Holocaust denial and anti-Jewish violence. And there was a motion to delete from that particular session any reference to hatred toward Israel and the Jewish people. It was roundly defeated. And the only people who voted with us were the Jewish caucus members. The haters and the deniers left Durban emboldened to continue their multi-pronged attacks upon the very existence of Israel. And that blossomed in multiple ways. You had the Second Intifada that had already started in 2000 after Arafat left Camp David in the summer of 2000. And then in the fall of 2000, the Second Intifada emerged. So there we were in Durban, and the Second Intifada was ongoing. The BDS movement really grew up. Pamphlets were handed out about boycotting Israel, and it wasn't just the Arab League boycott. They now were looking to embed in the minds of people, take it to your communities, that we must engage in the boycott, divestment of assets, and sanctions against Israel. And so it moved from just the Arab League boycott to a whole movement, a boycott movement that arose in Durban and really blossomed immediately thereafter. And their target was indeed the college campuses first, because they knew that if they could peddle their hate on the college campuses, they would teach people to be haters forever. And we are battling that today.
So, Irwin, this is the 20th year after the conference and the DDPA. How do you think the world has changed in the last 20 years on issues relating to Israel's place in the world and anti-Semitism, racism? If the UN had decided to proactively hold a new racism conference, to draft a new document instead of the commemorative events of the 2001 conference, do you believe the outcome would likely be better than, or worse than, or the same as 2001?
I think the big difference now then is that Durban served as a wake-up call, for the not necessarily for the international community, but certainly for the Jewish community, for Jewish NGOs and the like. I think there was a recognition then that if this festival of hate could take place, as Richard mentioned, amidst the worst kind of terrorist bombing in Israel, targeting Israeli civilians day after day, at the same time that Israel would be itself continuously demonized, dehumanized, and delegitimated as being itself a crime against humanity. I think this kind of thing would not be able to occur both in its planning and in its existence in the same way then. But at the same time, let us not forget that the seeds that were planted at Durban have in themselves expanded. So what we're seeing, and I think this is very important in terms of today's situation, has been the laundering of the delegitimization of Israel, or the laundering of a new anti-Semitism under the cover of universal values. Just four examples, laundering it under the protective cover of the United Nations, where annually you get 17, 18 resolutions that single out one state for selective opprobrium and indictment. That state happens to be Israel, while giving exculpatory immunity to the rest of the community. Now, why the rest of the human rights violations? Why that's important is because those resolutions were themselves invoked in the recent, ICC pleadings and the like. Number two, the laundering of the delegitimization under the authority of international law. And I've given you some examples already how that began right after Durban and has been enhanced since. Third, the laundering under the protective cover of the culture of human rights, represented by the UN Council on Human Rights, which is going to be meeting next week, where here too, not only is Israel in the docket, but formally the target at every meeting of the UN Human Rights Council, and I've been there, under Agenda 7 item, singling out, Israeli violations of human rights in the occupied territories and Palestine. The only country that is subjected in a kind of Alice in Wonderland situation to condemnation and sentencing even before the hearing begins. And finally, and perhaps the most pernicious, is the laundering of this new anti-Semitism under the struggle against racism. In other words, in the duality of Israel being held out not only as an apartheid state, because we know in international law, apartheid is defined as a crime against humanity. Therefore, if Israel is an apartheid state, that means it's a crime against humanity. That means it has no right to be. Then when you add to that the scurrilous indictments that Israel is behaving like a Nazi state, then not only does it have no right to be, but we are obliged, as it were, to see to it that it has no right to be, because it is both an apartheid and Nazi state. So the scurrilous indictments are there, and they would be part of another convening conference and make themselves felt. But I think all this served as a wake-up call for the international, for the Jewish community then, and for some in the international community. I think in that sense, we would not witness another Durban, though we would witness the manifestations of some of the things at Durban in another conference.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, and as Richard points out, I mean, you had the Arab boycott. It's just the idea of isolating Israel internationally, or the early attempts to delegitimize Israel were all out there since 1948. But I think it's something that we are looking at one conference over several days 20 years ago that spawned so much of the vernacular that we use, and alerted us. You're absolutely right. Alerted us to what was coming down the road. I think is extremely important. And I'd like to get into some of the UN issues in just a moment. But Richard, how do you look at it? 20 years since Israel's place in the world, anti-Semitism, racism. Your thoughts?
Well, Dan, with all the terrible things that occurred in Durban, with the stand that we took to walk out, with our fears, but also emboldened expectations that we would battle against the hatred after Durban as an organized, cohesive Jewish community that had come together in Durban. Everything changed on 9/11, just a few weeks after the Durban conference. Because as we all know, the United States was tragically and heinously attacked by terrorists. And the messages of Durban were almost immediately repressed, unfortunately, because we began to focus on the need, at least here in the United States and around the free world, to stand against terrorists. But we didn't continue our resolve because I believe we lost focus because of 9/11. We didn't continue the resolve we had when we left Durban to stand against the political hate, the diplomatic hate, the trial of Israel in the court of public opinion, because 9/11 became an all-encompassing battle as a war against terror. Returning from Durban was a traumatic experience. I remember we were stranded, and when the World Trade Center buildings went down and we received a call from our daughter Stephanie saying the borders of the United States were closed. And the B'nai B'rith delegation was still on the ground in the area, some in Durban, but not attending the conference, others in neighboring countries. We were able to get out, many of us, eventually on flights into Geneva or Zurich. And we were kept there until the borders of the United States would permit planes to land. So we were really all focused on the terror attacks. But in the wake of the events, both of the Second Intifada, of Durban, and of 9/11, we all must understand, and B'nai B'rith is leading the way to understand that the hateful impact of the Durban conference has to be viewed in this 20-year look back that B'nai B'rith has launched to help people understand that, yes, the seeds of hatred against Israel and the Jewish people were not just sown at Durban. They were planted a long time earlier, but they were embodied in the United Nations so strongly in Durban that for 20 years, the United Nations countries have been beating and beating and beating on Israel with resolutions blindly being supported. But out on, as I said earlier, the college campuses, and reporters, and editorial writers, and NGOs who don't see the world the way we see the world, have all gathered together in a very organized way against Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. And over these last 20 years, the banging has become quite loud. It is amazing that only recently we see the beginnings of a breakdown because of the Abraham Accords. And one comment, Dan, that I think is worth connecting. I mentioned earlier that the Arab boycott existed from the Arab League. The UAE was one of the leading countries of the Arab League that was cited by the US Department of Commerce for its anti-boycott activity for every single year from when the legislation was passed until now when the Abraham Accords were signed. The fact that we're seeing some hope coming through the Abraham Accords is wonderful for Israel, and I believe wonderful for the Jewish people, wonderful for all of us who love and respect dignity of men and women and want to see a regional stabilization and peace. But that does not mean that the boycott movement has subsided. It is well funded, and I must add, it is supported and organized by the designated foreign terrorist organizations, who are the same terrorist organizations that launch missiles, rockets, incendiary devices on kites and balloons. And they're the same people who call for the annihilation of Israel and the Jewish people, supported by Iran, Iran, Iran. Their money, their military, and their propaganda supports these activities. It is hateful, and we have to understand the dominant role that Iran has played and continues to play as a terror state, supporting terror organizations and proxies, and using all of these well-funded vehicles to express hate against the Jewish people and to teach so many, especially young people, that it's okay to hate. Well, B'nai B'rith stands up for the fact that it is not okay to hate anyone.
You know, Dan, when Richard was speaking about the return from Durban, I was reminded I also flew back from Durban to Canada, and I arrived the night before the morning of 9/11, and I'll never forget that. And I said then, and I feel the same way, that if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, then Durban was the Mein Kampf, and that 9/11 overshadowed Durban, as Richard said, but Durban foreshadowed 9/11 with its panoply of incitement and hate and the like. And Richard made an important point also about the campus situation, because the campus culture very much holds itself out as a human rights culture. And since delegitimization is laundered under the culture of human rights, so it's laundered within the campus culture. And Palestinianism has become the poster child for the struggle for human rights on the campuses, and Israel is seen as the meta human rights violator in the campus culture. Since this is the generation of future leadership, our focus has to be very much on that campus culture, and we have to engage with it within the language and understanding of that culture of human rights if we want to both address it and redress the delegitimization.
Well, that leads me, thanks, Irwin. That leads me to my next question, really. And Richard is right. The Abraham Accords, really, it speaks volumes about shifts in regional thinking, about stability in the region. The Arab League's, we're talking about the Arab boycott of Israel, but the Arab League's notable silence after the signing of the Abraham Accords certainly is something worth noting. And I think we can see that in terms of what's happened over the past year, in terms of the normalization, from the days of the infamous 3 no's of the 1967 Arab League summit of no peace with Israel, no recognition, no negotiations, slowly being replaced by something called normalization, which is all to the good. But on the other hand, we continue to witness travesties and other systemic bias against Israel, as you pointed out earlier, in multinational, multilateral organizations, including one recently at the World Health Organization on COVID and Israel and vaccination of Palestinians, or COVID generally being not necessarily being said in the UN, but we hear in many other places that COVID is something, for example, it was manufactured by Israel in order for Israel to manufacture vaccines and to benefit from the COVID crisis. And then just a week ago, as you mentioned, the International Criminal Court claimed that it has jurisdiction to investigate Israel for war crimes, and has determined that Palestine is a state. So we could argue that there's been some progress over the last 20 years, but in terms of Israel emerging from its diplomatic isolation, but you could also say that here we go again. With the obsessive focus on Israel. Are we taking one step forward and 2 steps backward? And then let me follow that with really my final question. What more can those of us in the Israel advocacy world be doing to fight back? We feel, no question, we have truth on our side, we have the arguments on our side. How do we fight back to win?
Well, I think, we've taken steps forward, but we're held back by the backward steps that began in Durban, which became a manifesto for the struggle against the legitimacy of the State of Israel since then. But it brings me to your important point. What is it that we can now do? And I think there are a number of priorities that we have to bear in mind. Number one, I think we have to unmask and expose the ongoing delegitimization of Israel under the cover of human rights. I think that's very important to do that. Second, I think we have to address and redress the laundering of the delegitimization or the laundering of the new anti-Semitism within the international UN human rights culture system and the like. Number three, we need to enhance the adoption and the implementation of the IRA definition. We have here a very important resource, one that is adopted and was not adopted in whole cloth. It was adopted after a protracted intergovernmental, parliamentary, civil society discussion and debate. And we have, therefore, in that the metrics of both the old and the new anti-Semitism, and it's a very effective framework. And those who seek to rebut it by saying that it, for example, silences speech, on the contrary, it's intended to protect speech. It's intended to protect the speech, for example, of Jewish students and their supporters on the campuses whose speech is being silenced as they are bullied or excluded from the campus culture. And it expressly says that it supports, criticism of Israel, so long as it does not cross the line with respect to the red flags that are indicated in the definition. Number four, I think we have to really deal with the explosion of anti-Semitism online. As we're speaking, the UK report on anti-Semitism has just come out, showing the extent to which the pandemic and online anti-Semitism have both incentivized and increased that anti-Semitism. Number five, I think we have to work together. The Biden administration has announced that the protection of human rights, the promotion of democracy will be a priority in American foreign policy. Well, we have to say that a priority in the protection of human rights, in the promotion of democracy, has to be the combating of anti-Semitism, which itself constitutes an assault on human rights. And as Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, said in his landmark report, is toxic to democracies. So these are some of the things that I think we can be doing, and I believe we will find allies out there for it.
Richard, same question, final word.
Dan, I think it's very essential that we all understand that the opposition here lives by the mantra that Israel should not exist as a state, much less as a Jewish state. Many follow what the Ayatollah has said from Iran, and that is that Israel should be eliminated. Remember that it was in Iran that they gathered a world conference on the Holocaust for the purpose of denying the Holocaust. What we have seen over the last 20 years is this multi-pronged propaganda, but not just with words, but with coordinated action that is not being diminished, quite to the contrary. Terror continues, diplomatic terror continues, diplomatic assaults continue, the use of the boycott movement continues, and the use of the United Nations as a venue for expressing hatred continues. The Durban conference was an official conference, just like the Nairobi conference was an official UN conference. In 2009, the UN, promoting what went on in Durban, held a Durban Review Conference. B'nai B'rith was invited, and we went. And at that conference, it continued to express blind, unabated, unabashed hatred toward Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people, and what expressed a commitment, a binding commitment to advance the Durban agenda of castigating Israel in every possible avenue and venue. A little noticed action at the United Nations recently occurred, and I'm not talking about all the votes against Israel. Those we expect every year. Some budget money was allocated to recognize 20 years since Durban. And on the United Nations calendar now appears somewhere around September 1st, 2021, something that will review Durban. It's not going to stop. So it seems to me the lessons learned must be clear, and the passion that we all have must be renewed. But more importantly, we must understand that those who hate us and wish to kill the Jewish people, wish to kill Israel, are gathering forces every single day, and therefore we cannot let down. We must adopt a policy of zero tolerance toward every action, every utterance, every vote that occurs. When a member of Congress expresses anti-Semitism, whether they be on the right or on the left, they must be called out and they must be castigated themselves. And when United Nations ambassadors vote blindly against Israel, they must be taught otherwise. Dan, as you well know, the American Zionist movement, along with the March of the Living, in my capacity as president of AZM and Phyllis's capacity of the March of the Living, over the last 2 years, we've taken 100 different UN ambassadors to Auschwitz-Birkenau, to Majdanek, and to other sites of the Holocaust, and then on to Israel, so that they could go into a gas chamber, look up at the shower heads, and understand that people were murdered, and that we as a universe cannot tolerate that any longer. We can't just spew human rights as Irwin has talked about. We must practice human rights for all people, and that includes for the Jewish people. We are not a second-class people. We have contributed enormously to the world, and we will continue to do so because that is our commitment. Those are our teachings. So as we move forward in this year of the 20th year since Durban, and with B'nai B'rith under Chuck Kaufman's leadership and your leadership, Dan, having said we will lead a review of Durban, a look back on the hate fest of 20 years and how it has manifested itself. We have a lot of lessons to teach and a lot of lessons to learn. And the most important one for us to learn is that we are a proud people with a proud tradition. We have contributed to the world, and we have the right to be proud of ourselves, including our commitment as a people and as a state to human rights and to the dignity of all people and to better lives for the Israelis, for the Palestinians, for the Jordanians, for the Egyptians, and for all those who wish to have peace. Let peace in 2021 be the mantra that we follow, because the seeds of that peace have been planted through the Abraham Accords, and kol hakavod to all of those who made it happen. They deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for making it happen. Who would have imagined Arab countries from the Arab League abrogating the Arab League boycott and saying we are ready for peace, and signing and shaking hands and now exchanging economic interests and exchanging academic interests and respecting religious interests. So in conclusion, what we must do as B'nai B'rith International, what we must do as the Jewish people is stand proudly, stand strongly, and not silently. We must be determined to teach the lessons of the past as we are committed to building a better future.
Well, Irwin, Richard, we really appreciate your sharing your reflections on the infamous Durban conference 20 years later, and especially your ongoing commitment to speaking out against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism wherever it occurs, as you did 2 decades ago in Durban and anywhere else that it occurs. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Dan. Pleasure appearing together with Richard.
Likewise.
Well, our thanks to Professor Irwin Cotler and AZM President and former B'nai B'rith President Richard Heideman for delving into the hateful but consequential 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban and how the effects of that conference are still being felt to this day. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you all again soon. Take care.